My parents stole my house and gave it to my sister. But they were not expecting what I did next. Hello, read it. There's a moment in life when you realize that everything you believed in, stability, security, trust, was nothing more than an illusion. That moment doesn't come with warning signs. It sneaks up on you slowly, piece by piece, unraveling the reality you thought you understood until one day, the floor disappears beneath your feet. For me, that moment didn't come as a single, shocking betrayal. It was years in the making, hidden in the smallest moments, the casual remarks, the things I should have questioned but never did. Looking back, the signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. I'm Nathan, 34 years old. I've never been the reckless type. I wasn't the kid who partied in college or traveled the world with nothing but a backpack and a dream. I was the one who stayed behind, who saved, who built. While my friends chased experiences, I chased security. And that pursuit led me to the one thing I could truly call mine, a house. Owning a home was never just about property to me. It was about control. Growing up, I watched my parents struggle. I saw the stress on their faces when bills piled up, the arguments over money that lasted deep into the night. I remember the way my mother would sit at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, try to make numbers stretch further than they could. My father was the kind of man who believed in survival, not sentimentality. If something wasn't useful in the immediate sense, it wasn't worth holding on to. That mentality shaped my childhood in ways I never fully understood until I was older. We never stayed in one place for long. My father always had an excuse, better opportunities, lower rent, fewer expenses. But even as a child, I could tell that wasn't the whole story. We moved because we had to, because we were always one misstep away from losing everything. I never unpacked fully because there was no point. Within a year, maybe two if we were lucky, we'd be somewhere new. I learned not to get attached to places, to rooms, to the feeling of permanence. I stopped making friends because goodbyes were inevitable. My life was measured in temporary addresses and rushed departures. I promised myself that when I grew up, things would be different. So I worked hard. I started young, picking up extra shifts, doing side jobs, anything to save. I didn't go on vacations. I didn't upgrade my car when everyone else did. While my coworkers went out for drinks after work, I went home and calculated expenses. Every dollar had a purpose. Every sacrifice had a reason. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was working for a future. And by the time I was 25, I had done what few in my family had ever managed to do. I bought a house. It wasn't a grand estate, but it was mine. A 2-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood. A place where I could finally breathe, where I could finally stop worrying about when the next move would come. For the first time in my life, I had roots. At first, my parents seemed proud. My mother fussed over decorating ideas. My father inspected the structure like he was assessing an investment. My sister, Emma, was indifferent. She had never been one to care much about responsibility. She was the golden child, the one my parents always seemed to bend the rules for. Where I had to work for everything, she was handed things with a smile and an excuse. She was the free spirit while I was the overachiever. That was the dynamic. That had always been the dynamic. She never stayed in one place for long, either, but for entirely different reasons. She was never forced to move, she just did. Whenever things got difficult, she ran. Jobs, apartments, relationships, it didn't matter. The moment something required effort, she walked away. And my parents always caught her. They paid her rent when she was between jobs, covered her expenses when she was finding herself, stepped in whenever life became too real for her. I resented it, but I never said anything. It wasn't my business. But my house was. And I should have seen the signs. I should have questioned the way my mother always spoke about my house in the future tense. When you move out, when you start a family somewhere else, when you decide to sell. I should have noticed the way my father kept suggesting I rent it out, as if my living there was just a temporary thing. I should have wondered why my sister had suddenly started taking an interest in real estate, why she kept asking me about mortgages, about refinancing, about the technical aspects of homeownership when she had never cared before. But I didn't. I ignored the warning signs because I wanted to believe my sacrifices meant something. That for once, what I had built was mine and mine alone. The years passed, and I grew more comfortable. I settled into a routine, enjoying the stability I had fought for. My job was steady, my bills were manageable, and I had even started to consider what was next, maybe renovations, maybe turning the spare bedroom into an office. The idea of leaving had never crossed my mind. Then the little things started happening. The first was when I caught my mother walking through my house unannounced. She had a spare key, which I had given her for emergencies, but I came home from work one evening to find her standing in my kitchen, opening cabinets, running her fingers over the countertops like she was evaluating them. When I asked what she was doing, she just smiled and said she was just checking on things. Then my sister started showing up more often, sometimes with my parents, sometimes alone. She never came empty-handed. She always had a reason to be there. Dropping off something my mother had baked, bringing over old childhood photos she thought I might want, asking if she could use my Wi-Fi because hers was acting up. She lingered in the hallways, commenting on how cozy the place was, how perfect it would be for a small family. I should have asked questions. I should have pressed for answers. But I didn't. Then, one day, my father made an offhand comment that sent a chill through me. "You won't be here forever, you know." It was the way he said it, like it was a certainty, not a possibility. Like he knew something I didn't. I laughed it off at the time. I told myself I was imagining things. But deep down, something shifted. A quiet unease began to creep into my thoughts, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. And soon, I would learn just how little my sacrifices meant to the people I had trusted most. The feeling of unease settled in like a low fog, something I couldn't see clearly but could sense was there. It lingered in the way my mother hesitated before speaking whenever the topic of my house came up. It was in the way my father stopped asking about my long-term plans, as if he already knew what they were. It was in the way my sister lingered in my space, taking everything in like she was imagining herself there. I told myself I was being paranoid, but paranoia doesn't come with a paper trail. It started with the mail. One afternoon, I came home from work and saw an envelope sticking out of my mailbox. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Emma, my sister, and my address. I froze, staring at the name, my pulse thudding against my ribs. It had to be a mistake. Maybe she had accidentally used my address for something, some kind of mix-up. I tossed it aside and told myself not to overthink it. But then it happened again, and again. Letters, small packages, even utility notices, Emma's name, my house. I confronted my mother about it during one of her unannounced visits. She smiled, waving it off as nothing. Emma just needs a stable mailing address for now. She's moving around a lot, and it's just easier. Easier. That word sat in my gut like a stone. Emma had been bouncing from one place to another for years, never staying anywhere for too long. I had long since stopped asking why. There was always an excuse, always a reason she couldn't stay where she was. But what did my house have to do with any of that? I wanted to brush it off, let it go. But something told me this was bigger than mail. The real warning came a few weeks later. I was in the kitchen, sorting through my bills, when I noticed something strange with my mortgage statement. The balance looked off. I had always been meticulous about my finances. I knew exactly how much I owed, how much I had paid, and how much longer I had to go. But the numbers weren't adding up. At first, I thought it was a bank error, a simple miscalculation. I grabbed my laptop, logged into my account, and scrolled through the transaction history. And that's when I saw it. A transfer. A significant one. Something was paid off. My stomach twisted as I read through the details. It wasn't a regular payment. It was a lump sum, a massive reduction in what I owed. Someone had tampered with my mortgage. Someone had altered the financial history of my house. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the screen. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I tried to make sense of it. Who would pay down my mortgage without telling me? The idea that it was some kind of clerical error became harder to believe the more I stared at the numbers. This was planned. It was intentional. And for some reason, it made my skin crawl. I thought back to all the strange little signs. The way my parents acted like my time in the house was limited, the way Emma kept showing up more and more, the way she talked about the house as if it belonged to her. My head was spinning, 1,000 possibilities running through my mind, but none of them prepared me for what I would uncover next. The next day, I went to the bank. I wanted answers. I expected resistance, maybe a long wait, maybe even an argument about why I couldn't access certain details. But what I found was worse. When I asked for a full record of my mortgage payments and recent transactions, the banker hesitated. She gave me a strange look before excusing herself and disappearing into a back office. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. When she returned, her expression was polite but guarded. She handed me a printed document and said nothing. I took the papers and left without reading them, my hands already clammy with dread. Sitting in my car, I unfolded the pages and scanned them line by line. My stomach twisted as I reached the bottom of the last page. My name was still on the documents, but something was different. A co-owner had been added. Months ago, someone else now had legal claim to my house. I scanned the name, my eyes burning with disbelief. It was Emma, my sister. I felt the air leave my lungs. It didn't make sense. How? When? Why? I flipped through the documents, my mind racing. There had to be a mistake. A forgery. Something. But the longer I looked, the more the truth stared back at me in cold, undeniable print. Emma had been added to the deed. Ownership had been shared. And I had never known. I tried to remember if I had signed anything, if there had ever been a moment where I had unknowingly allowed this to happen. But I had been careful. I had always been careful. I had reviewed every document, checked every agreement. There was no way I had agreed to this, which meant only one thing. Someone else had done it for me. I gripped the papers so tightly my hands ached. My parents. They were the only ones who had access to my personal information, the only ones who had always treated my house like it was a family asset instead of something I had earned. It all made sense now. The way my mother acted like my living there was temporary, the way my father always insisted I wouldn't be there forever. They had planned this, and I had walked right into it. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my mind spinning, my chest tightening with rage. I had spent years working for this house, sacrificing for it, pouring every ounce of my effort into making sure it was secure. And just like that, my parents had undone it. Without my knowledge, without my consent. The house wasn't fully mine anymore. Emma had a legal claim to it now. And if I knew my sister, I knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop at half. Emma had been in my house. That thought consumed me, burning itself into my mind as I sat in my car, staring at the now empty driveway where her car had been just minutes ago. She had stood on my porch, looked me in the eye, and said she was getting a feel for our house. The audacity of it left me paralyzed with rage. She hadn't asked. She hadn't waited for my approval. She had walked right in, treating my home like it was already hers. And legally, she wasn't wrong. The deed with her name on it was sitting on my kitchen table, a cruel reminder of how easily my parents had wiped away years of my sacrifice. I forced myself to move, stepping out of my car and into the house. It felt different now, like something had been tainted. The familiar comfort I once had was gone, replaced by an unsettling awareness that someone else thought they had a claim to this space. I locked the door behind me, a useless gesture, considering that Emma now had just as much legal right to enter as I did. That fact alone made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the night pacing, running through my options. I could confront my parents, but I already knew how that would go. They'd gaslight me, tell me I was overreacting, that this was a family decision and that I should be happy to share. If I went straight to Emma, it wouldn't matter. She thrived on conflict, and any pushback would only feed her ego. The idea of taking legal action crossed my mind, but I knew that would take time, money, and energy, resources I couldn't afford to waste, not when Emma was already making herself comfortable. The next morning, I was running on barely 2 hours of sleep when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "We need to talk. Come by the house tonight." I knew exactly what this was. A setup, a carefully planned meeting where they would explain their decision and expect me to nod along like a good son. They weren't calling to ask for my opinion. They had already made up their minds. The entire day was a blur. I went through the motions at work, barely registering conversations, my thoughts spinning in an endless loop of anger and disbelief. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening, I felt like I was walking into an ambush. The lights were on, shadows moving inside, and through the window, I saw them already sitting in the living room, waiting. And of course, Emma was there too. I clenched my jaw. I should have expected it. The second I stepped inside, the tension hit me like a wall. My mother sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and Emma, she was draped across the couch, completely at ease, like she had already won. The air was thick with unspoken words, but I knew how this was going to play out before the first sentence even left my mother's lips. She spoke in that gentle, condescending tone she always used when she was trying to manipulate me. They had been thinking about the future, about what was best for everyone, about how it didn't make sense for me to keep the house all to myself. My stomach turned, but I said nothing. I let them keep talking, their voices blending into a nauseating stream of justification. My father chimed in, telling me that Emma needed stability, that she was starting a family. The weight of that sentence hit me like a freight train. My mother's eyes softened as she explained. Emma was pregnant, and just like that, everything fell into place. That was why they had done this, why they had slipped her name onto the deed without telling me. A baby meant she deserved the house more than I did. A baby meant I was expected to step aside, to understand, to be the reasonable one, because I was just one person, while Emma now had a family to think about. The realization sent a cold wave of fury through me. My sacrifices, my hard work, my years of careful planning and responsible decisions, they meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was that Emma had gotten pregnant, and in my parents' eyes, that trumped everything. They moved quickly to the next step, presenting their solution like it was a gift. Sell the house to Emma. Let her buy you out. We'll make sure you get a fair amount. I barely held back my laughter. Fair. That was what they called this. They had stolen my house right out from under me, and now they wanted me to sell it to Emma as if this had been my decision all along. I kept my expression neutral, even as my nails dug into my palms. They weren't asking. They were telling me what was going to happen. And Emma, she didn't even pretend to be apologetic. She just sat there, watching, waiting. She didn't speak until the very end, when she decided to twist the knife just a little deeper. If I didn't sell, things would get messy. The words hung in the air, unspoken but clear. She had already won half the battle, but if I resisted, she was prepared to make my life hell. She brought up the mortgage, casually reminding me that we were both responsible now. If I stopped paying, the bank wouldn't care whose fault it was. They'd just come for the house. She didn't have to spell it out. I knew exactly what she was saying. If I didn't walk away willingly, she was more than happy to let everything collapse. That was when I understood the full scope of their plan. They had backed me into a corner, thinking I had no way out. If I refused to sell, I would still be stuck paying for a house that wasn't mine alone. And if I stopped, if I let the payments lapse, the bank would take the house anyway. Either way, I lost, and Emma walked away with exactly what she wanted. I stood up without a word, walked to the door, and left. My parents didn't try to stop me. Emma didn't say anything. They didn't need to. In their minds, the conversation was over. They had given me my options, and now it was up to me to choose which way I wanted to lose. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I had never felt rage like this before. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something raw and bitter, something that burned in my chest like acid. They thought they had won. They thought they had trapped me, that my only choices were to sell or to drown in debt. But they were wrong, because I wasn't going to give up that easily. If Emma wanted to play dirty, then so could I. The drive home was a blur, my mind spinning through everything that had just happened. My parents and Emma had laid their trap, and they expected me to fall right into it. They thought they had me backed into a corner, with no choice but to sell the house to Emma for whatever price they decided was fair, or to let the mortgage bleed me dry until I had no option but to walk away. They had done all of this behind my back, treating my home like a chess piece to be moved and sacrificed as they saw fit, and they expected me to just go along with it. They thought they had me, but they had underestimated me. They assumed I would keep paying, that I would struggle, panic, drain my savings trying to keep up with payments on a house that legally no longer belonged entirely to me. But if Emma wanted to claim ownership, then she could start dealing with everything that came with it. That night, I didn't sleep. I went through every financial document I had, studying every detail. My mortgage agreement, my insurance policies, my bank statements, every single thing that tied me to this house. Emma's name was on the deed now. That meant she wasn't just a co-owner. She was co-responsible. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I canceled every single payment tied to the house. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, everything. The bills, the financial burden, the consequences. I let them all land squarely on Emma's shoulders. The first week passed without a word. I watched the overdue notices start to arrive, their crisp white envelopes stacking up on the counter. Electricity, water, internet, all of them carrying the same message: payment overdue. Immediate action required. Then came the first letter from the bank, a polite reminder that a payment had been missed. The next one was firmer in tone. The calls started soon after, unknown numbers lighting up my phone at all hours of the day. I didn't answer. Then the calls from my mother started. At first, they were casual, as if she was just checking in. But I knew what she was really doing. She wanted to see if I would mention the bills, to gauge whether I was struggling, to nudge me into admitting I needed help. I ignored those too. 2 weeks in, Emma showed up. She didn't knock. She let herself in because legally she could. She found me in the kitchen, sipping my coffee like it was any other morning, while she stormed in, her face red with frustration. She was clutching a letter from the bank, waving it at me like I was supposed to care. She demanded to know why the mortgage hadn't been paid, why she was getting calls from the bank, why her credit had taken a hit. I took another sip of my coffee and reminded her, calmly, that this was her house too now, and homeowners had responsibilities. I saw it the moment it hit her, the realization that she wasn't playing house anymore, that this wasn't just some title on a piece of paper, that she had no idea what she had gotten herself into. She shouted, she threatened, she called me selfish, but none of it mattered. I let her rage, let her stomp around, let her voice echo through the house. Then, when she had finally exhausted herself, I told her flatly, if she wanted the house, she needed to pay for it. The look on her face was priceless. It was the look of someone who had spent her entire life getting bailed out, only to realize that this time, there was no one coming to save her. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but I knew she wasn't done. Emma was too stubborn to admit she had made a mistake, too entitled to believe she had actually lost. Over the next week, the house became a war zone. The power was shut off first, then the water. I waited for Emma to fix it. She didn't. The heat went next. I spent nights bundled up under blankets, comfortable in my knowledge that I could outlast her. She, on the other hand, had never known struggle. She had never been forced to endure discomfort. She had always had an escape, a safety net, someone to take care of things for her. But not this time. Then my parents got involved. My mother left voicemail after voicemail, her voice tinged with a frustration I had never heard before. She begged me to be reasonable, to think about family, to fix this before it got out of control. My father even called once, though his message was short and clipped, laced with barely restrained anger. They weren't calling because they cared about me. They were calling because they were realizing, too late, that they had made a mistake. 3 weeks in, Emma cracked. I came home one evening to find her sitting on the front steps, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched another letter from the bank. She didn't yell this time. She didn't demand anything. She just looked up at me, exhausted and desperate, and admitted that she couldn't do it. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Her credit was destroyed. She had gone to my parents for help, but even they had limits. They couldn't keep covering for her. That was the moment I knew I had won. Emma wasn't just losing the house. She was losing everything. Her finances were in ruins. Her reputation was shattered. And for the first time in her life, she had to face the consequences of her actions without a safety net. The next morning, my mother called. There was no anger in her voice this time. No condescension, no passive-aggressive guilt-tripping. Just exhaustion. She asked how we could fix this. She was looking for a way out. I let the silence stretch before I answered. There was only one solution. I would take back full ownership of the house. Emma's name would be removed from the deed permanently. But I wasn't going to clean up their mess for free. If they wanted me to fix this, they were going to have to pay. I named my price. More than the house was worth. more than what they had ever expected to pay. My father argued, but my mother didn't even hesitate. She agreed immediately. She just wanted this nightmare to be over. Days later, the paperwork was signed. Emma's name was gone. The house was mine again. I stood in the empty kitchen after they left, listening to the silence, letting the relief wash over me. It was over. They had tried to take my home from me, but in the end, all they had done was destroy themselves. Emma had learned, in the hardest way possible, that entitlement couldn't buy responsibility. My parents had learned that no matter how much they wanted to protect her, they couldn't shield her from reality forever. And I had learned something too. Never trust people to respect what you've built, because when they think they can take it from you, they will. And the next time someone tried to take something from me, I'd be ready. The house was mine again. The papers were signed. The deed was back in my name, and Emma was gone for good. No more shared ownership. No more threats hanging over my head. No more fights about what was rightfully mine. My parents had caved under the pressure, had paid the outrageous price I demanded, and had left with nothing but regret. Emma, humiliated and crushed under the weight of her own arrogance, had no choice but to walk away. She had tried to play the role of a homeowner, of a responsible adult, and had failed miserably. And now, in the end, she had lost the very thing she had schemed to steal. Victory should have felt sweet. I had spent months trapped in this battle, outsmarting my own family, forcing them to experience consequences for the first time in their lives. I had proven to them that I was not someone they could manipulate, that I was not a pawn in their twisted version of fairness. I had won. Yet, as I stood in my house that first night after the deal was finalized, I felt something I hadn't expected: emptiness. The house was mine again, but it didn't feel like home. The walls, the furniture, the rooms themselves, all of it still carried the weight of everything that had happened. The betrayal had seeped into the very foundation, poisoning the sense of safety I had once felt within these walls. No matter how much I told myself it was over, that I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine, something had changed. The house was exactly as it had been before, yet it was no longer mine in the way it had once been. Days passed in a fog of exhaustion. The phone call stopped. My parents had finally given up, realizing there was nothing left to discuss. No more pleas that could sway me. Emma disappeared completely. Not a single message, no pathetic attempts to guilt me into giving her another chance, nothing. And yet, I still felt like I was waiting for something. Some last desperate attempt to take one final piece of what I had fought so hard to keep. The moment finally arrived on a cold afternoon when my mother showed up unannounced at my front door. She stood there, shifting on her feet, looking at me with a mixture of exhaustion and forced warmth. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, no self-righteousness, no condescending lectures about family and responsibility. She just looked tired. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she was seeing things for what they truly were, without the delusions that had always blinded her to Emma's flaws. She started talking, and though I had expected a final plea for money or support, I was surprised by what she actually said. She spoke about Emma, about the aftermath of everything that had happened. Emma was struggling. She had lost not just the house, but her financial security, her pride, the endless safety net my parents had always provided for her. She had no backup plan, no emergency fund, no savings. Her credit was in ruins, her options limited. My parents had done their best to salvage what they could, but even they had their limits. I listened, but the words didn't stir any sympathy. Emma had put herself in this situation. She had taken something that wasn't hers, believing she could outmaneuver me, believing that she could manipulate the situation the way she always had. And she had failed. Now, she was facing consequences she had never been forced to experience before. My mother continued, saying that despite everything, she still hoped for reconciliation, that she didn't want this situation to break the family apart forever. She wanted to mend things, to rebuild what had been shattered. But I knew better. This wasn't about repairing relationships. This was about control. This was about trying to pull me back into their web, to make me feel obligated to help, to fix the damage they had caused. I let her talk herself in circles before finally making my decision. Without a word, I closed the door in her face. I didn't slam it. I didn't let my emotions get the best of me. I simply shut the door because there was nothing left to say. That was the last time I saw my mother. Weeks passed, and I tried to settle back into life as it had been before. I made repairs to the house, repainted the walls, replaced old fixtures, scrubbed away every last trace of Emma's presence. I thought that if I could restore the house physically, I could restore the way it had once felt. But no matter what I did, something was missing. The realization hit me late one night as I sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls that had once brought me comfort. It wasn't the house that had changed. It was me. I had spent years believing that this house was my anchor, my foundation, my security in a world that was always shifting beneath my feet. And for a time, it had been true. But then my own family had shattered that illusion. They had taken the one thing I believed was untouchable, the one thing I thought I could always rely on. And even though I had fought and won, even though I had forced them to pay for what they did, I could never unsee the truth. If my own family could take something from me so easily, then I had never truly owned it in the first place. I couldn't stay here, not because I had lost, but because I had won. I had reclaimed what was mine, and now it was time to move forward. Staying here, surrounded by the ghosts of the past few months, would keep me trapped in a battle that had already ended. The next morning, I made the decision. I put the house up for sale. The offers came quickly, higher than I expected. People wanted the house. They didn't see the history, the betrayal, the wounds embedded in its walls. To them, it was just a home, a fresh start, and that was exactly what I needed. When the sale was finalized, I packed my things, carefully going through every room one last time. Every item I placed in a box reminded me of the life I had built here, the years I had spent believing this house was the goal, the achievement that would define my success. And in a way it had, but not in the way I had originally imagined. This house had been my greatest battle, the proof that I could fight for myself when no one else would. But it was time to let it go. The last time I stepped out of that house, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel regret. I felt free. I moved to a new city, far from my parents, far from Emma, far from the place where they had tried to rewrite my future without my consent. I bought a new home, a fresh start, a place where my name was the only one on the deed, where no one could take from me what I had rightfully earned. And I made a promise to myself, never again. Never again would I allow myself to believe that hard work alone would protect me. Never again would I assume that family, no matter how close, wouldn't betray me for their own gain. Never again would I wait for someone to try and take from me. I would expect it. I would be ready. Because the truth was, when people saw something they wanted, they would take it if they thought they could get away with it. And the only way to stop them was to make sure they never got the chance.